11. At 58, Keith Urban's name still sounds like sunlight, guitars, stadiums, the kind of easy charm that makes a marriage look effortless on camera. And Nicole Kidman? She's always been the definition of controlled brilliance. Calm posture, careful words, eyes that never betray the storm behind them. For years, the world treated them like proof that fame doesn't have to ruin love. But the truth hiding inside this story isn't a tabloid punchline or a gotcha confession. It's something darker, slower, and more familiar than people want to admit. The way a relationship can become a survival system, not a romance, when one person is fighting themselves every day. In this narrative, Keith isn't describing horrors to humiliate Nicole. He's describing the horror of realizing your addiction doesn't just damage you. It turns your partner into a permanent watchtower, and it turns your home into a place where trust has to be measured like medication. It began like most great Hollywood myths do, a meeting that felt like destiny. Two Australians in an industry that eats people alive, colliding at the exact moment both were hungry for something steady. Nicole had already lived through a public marriage that taught her how fame can become a cage. Keith, beneath the music and the grin, carried the restless wiring of someone who doesn't do well with silence. In the beginning, their differences looked like balance, her stability, his warmth, her discipline, his freedom. But balance can shift into tension the second fear enters the room. They married, and the cameras froze their happiness into glossy photographs. Yet inside the private hours, Keith's calm began to feel like a threat. Not because he didn't love her, but because peace exposes the parts of you you've been using chaos to hide. He didn't know how to be loved without feeling like a fraud. So he started slipping away in the smallest, most deniable ways. Late nights that were studio time, drinks that were just taking the edge off, distance that was work. Nicole didn't need a headline to notice. She noticed the emptiness behind his eyes, the way the air changed when he walked into a room. And then the moment came that no couple can stylishly spin. She saw him fall apart. No performance, no charm, just a man collapsing in front of the one person who believed he could be better. That's the first fracture, because from that moment on, love wasn't just love anymore. It became vigilance. It became questions whispered at BAM. It became the terrifying realization that the person you adore can also be the person who might destroy everything you're trying to protect. And Keith, proud, talented, stubborn, felt the shame of being the problem hardened into something worse. Resentment. Not at her at first, at himself. But in marriages like this, self-hatred doesn't stay contained. It leaks. And once it leaks, the fairy tale ends, even if the photos keep pretending it hasn't. If part MOT was the fracture, part high is the aftermath, the quiet restructuring of a marriage that no longer feels spontaneous, but strategic. After rehab entered the story, everything changed in ways that outsiders rarely understand. Recovery is not a triumphant montage. It's not applause and clean slates. It's suspicion wrapped in hope. It's waking up every morning knowing you are being believed in and monitored at the same time. Keith came home sober, but sobriety did not magically restore equilibrium. In fact, in many ways, it intensified the imbalance. Because once someone has fallen, love often transforms into surveillance. Nicole did what many partners of addicts do. She organized. Therapists were scheduled. Trainers were hired. Diets were adjusted. Sleep patterns were tracked. Social circles were evaluated. On the surface, it looked supportive. And it was. But support can slowly evolve into structure, so rigid it starts to feel like control. Keith, who once commanded stages in front of thousands, began to feel smaller inside his own home. Every late arrival triggered a glance. Every mood swing raised a silent question. Every cancel plan had to be explained. He understood why. He had earned the scrutiny. But understanding something intellectually does not make it emotionally painless. A man who once felt adored now felt assessed. He wasn't being loved for who he was. He was being evaluated for who he might become again. And that is the second horror he hints at, the suffocation of conditional trust. Not because Nicole was cruel, not because she was manipulative, but because fear had entered her bloodstream, and fear doesn't leave easily once it has proof. Publicly, they were still the golden couple. Red carpets, interviews, award shows where he thanked her, and she smiled with quiet grace. The cameras captured the image of devotion. What they couldn't capture was the new language inside the house. Nicole's love had become cautious. Keith's gratitude had become defensive. She no longer slept deeply. Some nights, she would wake up and check if he was beside her. Other nights, she would subtly observe whether he seemed off. She wasn't policing him. She was protecting her future. But to him, it felt like living inside a glass box. Every action visible, every silence interpreted. Then came the subtle sparks that ignite larger fires. A photograph in a magazine with a young female singer. A rumor whispered online. A harmless collaboration reframed as something else. Nicole did not explode. She asked one question: who is she? And in that question lived all the unhealed fear of the past. Keith, instead of answering gently, reacted with wounded pride. Because shame hates suspicion. He felt accused before he felt understood. And once pride enters the argument, clarity leaves. The conversation turned brittle. She wasn't accusing him of infidelity. She was asking whether stability could survive temptation. He heard it as distrust. She meant it as self-preservation. That night, something subtle shifted. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a cooling. The warmth in the room dimmed slightly. And when warmth dims in a marriage, people look for heat elsewhere. Keith threw himself into touring again. He told himself it was passion. But beneath the surface, it was escape. On the road, no one looked at him like a liability. No one tracked his schedule with fear. On stage, he was powerful again. Applause is intoxicating in ways alcohol once was. And for someone who has battled addiction, adrenaline can masquerade as recovery. But distance amplifies insecurity. Texts became shorter. Calls became formal. Nicole, left behind with children and the echo of past trauma, began to fear not just relapse, but abandonment. And here lies the third horror: two people loving each other while preparing for disaster at the same time. She feared his collapse. He feared her control. Neither was entirely wrong. Neither was entirely right. The worst part? They both still loved each other deeply. That's what makes this story tragic rather than scandalous. There was no villain. There was no secret betrayal revealed under flashing lights. There was a man terrified of disappointing the woman who saved him. There was a woman terrified of reliving a nightmare she had already survived once before in her life. Love alone could not silence those fears. And so the marriage slowly transformed into something else. Not a fairy tale, not even a battlefield. It became a negotiation between trauma and redemption. Every day was a test neither of them wanted to fail. Every smile held a question underneath it. Are we safe today? When a relationship becomes about safety rather than joy, it doesn't explode overnight. It erodes, quietly, carefully. And by the time anyone notices, both people are exhausted from trying to keep something alive that now feels like it requires constant maintenance just to breathe. The real breaking point in stories like this is rarely a single scandal. It's accumulation. 1,000 restrained arguments. 1,000 swallowed fears. 1,000 nights where both people lie awake, pretending sleep because they don't want to reopen the same wound again. By the time the outside world starts whispering, the inside world has already been trembling for months. In this chapter of their marriage, what changed wasn't love, it was energy. Love was still there, but love had become heavy. Keith had worked hard to stay sober. Therapy sessions, routines, accountability. He wasn't careless anymore. He wasn't reckless. But recovery creates a strange paradox. The person trying to rebuild feels fragile, while the person who endured the damage feels permanently alert. Nicole could see his effort. She respected it, but she could not turn off the part of her brain that remembered 2006. The collapse, the fear, the headlines, the humiliation of watching the man she married unravel in front of the world. That memory lived quietly inside her like a locked drawer. Meanwhile, Keith carried a different memory, the feeling of being rescued, being sent to rehab less than 4 months into marriage, being the man who needed saving. Gratitude can slowly turn into guilt, and guilt, if it sits too long, curdles into resentment, not toward the person who helped you, but toward the version of yourself who needed help. That's where the tension sharpened. He would come home from tour energized, full of applause and momentum. She would meet him with warmth, but also with questions. How was the crowd? Who did you work with? What was the after-party like? Did you feel tempted? The questions weren't accusations. They were insurance policies. But insurance policies, repeated daily, begin to feel like probation. One evening, after a long tour stretch, he arrived home exhausted. The house was quiet. The kids were asleep. Nicole was sitting in the living room with a magazine folded on her lap. On the cover was a photograph of him laughing beside a younger female artist during a backstage moment. She didn't raise her voice. Who was she? She asked softly. He could have answered calmly. He could have reassured her gently. But something inside him snapped, not in anger at her, but in frustration at the fact that no matter how long he stayed sober, suspicion remained the background music. She's a colleague, he replied, sharper than necessary. Nicole held his gaze. Are you sure that's all? There it was. Not jealousy, not drama, fear. He laughed. Wrong move. If you don't trust me, who will you trust? The air shifted instantly. Trust is not restored by sarcasm. Nicole stood, walked to the kitchen, and set the magazine down carefully on the counter. I don't want to live waiting for the next crack, she said quietly. I've done that before. That sentence carried history. It carried her past. It carried the exhaustion of being a public woman whose private life had once exploded spectacularly. She was not accusing him of cheating. She was admitting she didn't know how to survive another collapse. Keith felt cornered. I'm not that man anymore, he insisted. I know, she replied, but I don't know who you become when you're scared. That line stayed with him long after the argument ended. Because she wasn't wrong. Fear had always been his trigger. Not temptation. Not ego. Fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of disappointing her. Fear of failing publicly. And when fear surfaced, he didn't always reach for her. Sometimes he reached for distraction. Touring intensified again. He told himself it was professional necessity. But beneath it was something simpler. Distance feels safer than being doubted in your own home. Nicole felt the distance immediately. Calls shortened. Messages became practical instead of intimate. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself recovery takes time. But her intuition rarely misfired. Then came the night that would echo for years. After a particularly grueling show in Nashville, instead of heading straight back to the hotel, Keith lingered. Not a wild party. Not in a scandalous situation. Just in a quiet bar with industry friends. A glass was placed in front of him. He stared at it for a long time. Recovery is often lost in ordinary rooms. He told himself one drink wasn't a relapse. He told himself he deserved one moment of not being the fragile one. He told himself it wouldn't spiral. But the second drink came easier. The next morning, he woke up not in disgrace, but in dread. His phone showed missed calls. Text from Nicole. One final message that read, "Are you okay?" The simplicity of that question hurt more than anger would have. He called her back. She answered on the second ring. "Did you drink?" she asked, her voice steady but thin. He paused too long. Silence can confess more than words. She exhaled softly, not rage, not hysteria, just something breaking quietly. "I can't do this again," she whispered. "I didn't spiral," he insisted. "It was just." "It's never just," she replied. And that was the moment he understood something brutal. Relapse doesn't need to be dramatic to be devastating. For someone who has been hurt before, even one step backward reactivates every old wound. When he returned home, the atmosphere felt different. Not explosive, just colder. Nicole wasn't shouting. She wasn't threatening. She was recalibrating. Boundaries tightened. Conversations became formal. The kids remained protected, shielded from adult tension. But adults can feel distance even when children cannot. Keith began to sense something else emerging. Nicole's independence hardening. She leaned more into work, more into structured routines, more into legal clarity. Not because she wanted to leave, but because she wanted guarantees. And that's when the topic of security surfaced. It wasn't introduced as punishment. It was framed as protection for the children, for assets, for stability. But the subtext was unmistakable. Love alone was no longer enough currency. Keith heard it as doubt. Nicole meant it as armor. The tragedy wasn't cruelty. It was incompatibility in how they processed trauma. He processed it through confession and music. She processed it through structure and prevention. One night, during a quiet argument that never raised above conversational tone, she said something that would haunt him. "I don't want to be your guardian. I want to be your partner." He responded without thinking. "Then stop treating me like I'm about to fall." She looked at him for a long time before answering. "Then stop standing so close to the edge." There was no villain in that room, just two exhausted people trying to protect different fears. And this is the part the public never understands. The horror wasn't screaming fights. It wasn't infidelity. It wasn't betrayal splashed across tabloids. It was the slow realization that healing does not erase memory. Even when a man stands sober in front of you, if you have once watched him collapse, part of you will always listen for the sound of falling again. And for Keith, the worst realization of all was this. He had become the person Nicole feared. Not because he was evil, but because he had proven once that love could not stop him from self-destruction. The marriage didn't shatter in one moment. It cracked under the weight of vigilance. And once vigilance becomes permanent, intimacy quietly packs its bags. By the time the word contract entered their conversations, the marriage had already shifted from romance to risk management. It didn't happen dramatically. There was no lawyer storming into the kitchen, no explosive confrontation under flashing cameras. It came quietly, like most life-altering decisions do. A conversation after dinner. The kids asleep upstairs. The house dim except for one lamp, casting a soft amber circle between them. Nicole spoke first. "I need us to be clearer about the future," she said carefully. "Not emotionally. Legally." Keith knew what she meant before she said the word. Security. Asset protection. Clauses. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "You think paper is going to fix what therapy hasn't." "It's not about fixing," she replied. "It's about protecting." There was again protection, the word that had defined their marriage since the first relapse. Protection from chaos. Protection from humiliation. Protection for the children. Protection for herself. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest. "From me?" he asked. Nicole didn't answer immediately. Silence, in their house, had become more revealing than arguments. "From history," she finally said. The draft arrived a few days later. Numbers, percentages, conditions, a clause addressing substance relapse, financial forfeiture in the event of another public breakdown, legal language colder than any accusation she had ever spoken aloud. He read it slowly. It wasn't the money that stung. It was the implication that no matter how many sober mornings he woke up to, no matter how many nights he stayed home, part of her still needed an escape hatch. He looked up from the pages. "Do you think I'm still that man?" Nicole's eyes softened, but did not waver. "I think you're trying. But trying isn't the same as certainty." That sentence landed like a verdict. Trying isn't certainty. He wanted to shout that certainty doesn't exist. That recovery is never guaranteed. That no human being can promise perfection. But he also understood something else. She wasn't asking for perfection. She was asking for assurance that if history repeated itself, she wouldn't be trapped inside the collapse. This wasn't cruelty. It was trauma speaking. But trauma, even when justified, can suffocate love. He pushed the document away. "If you need this to stay," he said quietly, "then maybe you've already left." Her composure cracked for the first time that evening. Not dramatically, just a flicker. "I stayed through everything," she whispered. "Don't rewrite that." He didn't respond, because she was right. She had stayed through rehab, through rumors, through public embarrassment, through nights where she didn't know if the man sleeping beside her would wake up stable or spiraling. But staying through something once doesn't mean you can survive it twice. The tabloids caught wind of the legal adjustments before they were finalized. A magazine headline appeared speculating about a $500 million marriage insurance clause. The phrasing was sensational, cruel, and irresistible to the public. Suddenly, their private boundary became public gossip. Keith read the headline, sitting alone in his car outside a recording studio. Marriage secured by cocaine clause. The words felt like acid. He had not relapsed into scandal. He had not destroyed their life again. Yet the narrative now reduced him to a risk factor priced into legal language. He called Nicole. "Did this leak from your side?" he asked. Her tone was exhausted, not defensive. "I don't know, but I didn't give them permission." Silence stretched between them. "You see what this does?" he continued. "It turns everything we fought for into a transaction." She inhaled slowly. "It turns fear into structure, and structure into humiliation," he replied. That night, alone in a Nashville apartment he sometimes used between tours, he poured himself a drink. Not in rebellion, not in self-destruction, but in exhaustion. He didn't get drunk. He didn't spiral. But he stared at the glass longer than he should have. Because humiliation is a dangerous trigger. 2 days later, Nicole returned from London earlier than scheduled. She entered the apartment without drama, without spectacle. She placed the unsigned contract on the table beside an old photograph. The four of them in the garden, sunlight cutting through leaves, the children laughing. "I don't want to do this," she said quietly, "but I can't raise them in uncertainty." Keith stood up, emotion finally breaking through his restraint. "I'm not drunk. I'm not high. I'm not lying," he said, voice shaking. "I'm just tired of proving I deserve to be loved." That was the first time she cried openly in front of him in months. "Do you think this is easy for me?" she asked through tears. "Do you think I enjoy turning love into paperwork?" He didn't answer, because he knew she didn't. But he also knew something else. Once love becomes conditional, even for understandable reasons, it changes form permanently. They sat on the floor that night, backs against the couch, neither speaking for a long time. No screaming, no threats, just exhaustion. Finally, she said something that shifted the air. "I'm not afraid of losing money," she admitted. "I'm afraid of our daughters growing up and thinking I didn't protect them." That sentence reframed everything. This wasn't about assets. It was about legacy, about children watching their parents fracture publicly, about preventing another collapse before it started. A week later, he signed. Not because he agreed with every word, not because he felt proud, but because he wanted to remove one more source of fear from her shoulders. He thought signing would quiet the storm. It didn't. The leak intensified. Talk shows debated whether their love was real. Commentators speculated about trust, addiction, control, financial power dynamics. He became a headline again. But something strange happened inside him. Instead of anger, he felt clarity. He realized that the true horror of the marriage wasn't Nicole's conditions. It wasn't the media. It wasn't even his past addiction. It was this. He had spent years fearing disappointing her more than he feared losing himself. Fear had dictated too many of his decisions. He loved her, but he loved her with anxiety instead of stability. And anxiety eventually erodes even the strongest bond. One evening, after another round of speculation flooded the internet, Nicole called him. "I'm sorry it's come to this," she said softly. He closed his eyes. "It didn't come to this because of the contract," he replied. "It came to this because we were both scared." She didn't argue, because she knew. The contract was never the cause. It was the symptom. The real fracture had been building for years, in therapy rooms, in late-night silences, in careful questions and careful answers. By the time the ink dried, the marriage wasn't exploding. It was transforming. From passion into partnership. From partnership into co-survival. From co-survival into something quieter. Not hatred, not betrayal, but a shared understanding that sometimes love changes form because it has to. And for the first time in years, Keith felt something unfamiliar. Not rebellion, not shame. Acceptance. Acceptance did not arrive like relief. It arrived like quiet. After the contract was signed and the headlines burned through their cycle of outrage, something unexpected happened inside Keith. The fight drained out of him. Not the will to stay sober. Not the love for his family. But the constant need to defend himself. For years he had lived in reaction, reacting to addiction, to shame, to scrutiny, to suspicion. Now, strangely, there was nothing left to react to. The worst had already been written. Nicole, too, shifted. The contract had not given her joy. It had given her boundaries. And boundaries, once set, reduce panic, but they do not restore intimacy. She no longer watched him the same way. Not because she suddenly trusted without fear, but because she had secured her exit if fear returned. And that is where the emotional temperature of their marriage changed permanently. They began functioning well. Too well. Dinners were polite. Schedules were coordinated. The children were protected from tension. They attended school events together, sat side by side, spoke kindly in public. If anyone looked from the outside, they would see stability. But stability is not the same as closeness. One evening, after putting the girls to bed, they sat at opposite ends of the living room couch. The television was on, volume low, neither really watching. Keith broke the silence first. "Are we okay?" he asked. Nicole didn't answer immediately. She had become careful with words, not withholding, just deliberate. "We're safe," she said. He nodded slowly. Safe. It was the word she had fought for. But he realized something in that moment. She had stopped using the word happy. Safety had replaced passion. Predictability had replaced spontaneity. There were no explosions anymore, but there were no sparks either. He returned to music with a different intention. Not to impress, not to escape, but to confess without drama. The songs he began writing were stripped down. No metaphor hiding truth, no romantic exaggeration. Just accountability. One night in the studio, he recorded a rough acoustic track that no one else heard. The lyrics were simple. "I loved you loud when I was afraid. I ran from silence. I hid in praise. You built a wall to keep us whole. I built a stage to save my soul." He listened back to the recording and realized something sobering. She had never tried to control him. She had tried to prevent disaster. And he had never tried to rebel against her. He had tried to reclaim dignity. Neither motive was malicious. Both were defensive. Weeks later, during a quiet drive home after a school recital, Nicole surprised him. "Do you ever resent me?" she asked, eyes fixed on the road. He thought carefully. "I resented feeling like a risk," he said honestly. "But I don't resent you." She nodded. "I resented feeling like a caretaker," she admitted. "But I never stopped loving you." The confession hung between them like fragile glass. That was the first truly honest exchange they had shared in months. Love had never disappeared. It had simply grown cautious. As the months passed, they established something new. Not reconciliation in the romantic sense, but equilibrium. They attended therapy not to fix betrayal, but to redefine partnership. They discussed co-parenting with clarity rather than accusation. They set expectations that were realistic instead of idealistic. And something subtle began to heal. Not the marriage as it once was, but the resentment. One afternoon, their eldest daughter asked a question that neither adult was prepared for. Why do grown-ups get scared of each other? The simplicity stunned them. Nicole looked at Keith before answering. Because sometimes, she said gently, grown-ups remember things that children don't have to. Keith added, and sometimes we forget that fear doesn't mean someone is bad. It just means they were hurt before. The child nodded, satisfied, then ran off. But the question lingered. Fear doesn't mean someone is bad. That realization reframed the entire narrative. Nicole's legal boundaries were not punishments. They were scar tissue. Keith's defensiveness was not arrogance. It was shame. The real horror of their marriage had not been addiction or contracts or media rumors. It had been fear misinterpreted as rejection. One night, after a long conversation about nothing in particular, Nicole stood up to go upstairs, then paused. "Do you ever wish we had met later in life?" she asked quietly. He understood what she meant. If they had met after recovery, after therapy, after the lessons. He smiled gently. "No," he said, "because then we wouldn't have learned how strong we are when we're weak." She held his gaze longer than usual. There was still affection there, but it had changed shape. It no longer burned. It glowed. They began walking together in the evenings, not holding hands like a red carpet couple, but walking side by side like partners who had survived something. They spoke less about the past and more about logistics, about the children, about projects, about the future. And strangely, that practical tone brought peace. Keith stopped trying to prove he deserved her. Nicole stopped trying to predict his collapse. They both began living in the present instead of rehearsing disaster. But the final shift came unexpectedly. At a benefit concert months later, Keith performed a stripped-back set. No spectacle, just guitar and voice. Toward the end, he paused and spoke into the microphone. "There's someone in this room who once saved me by leaving when I couldn't save myself," he said quietly. "And I want to thank her, not for staying, not for fixing me, but for refusing to drown with me." The room fell silent. Backstage, Nicole listened. Not as a wife, not as a critic, just as a woman who once loved fiercely and protected herself fiercely. When the show ended, she didn't rush to him. She didn't dramatize the moment. She simply texted one sentence. "I never wanted to win. I just wanted us to survive." He stared at the message for a long time. That was the truth. They weren't enemies. They weren't even tragic lovers. They were two flawed people who had tried, sometimes clumsily, to protect what mattered most. And in the end, what mattered most wasn't pride. It wasn't money. It wasn't reputation. It was survival. Their marriage may never again resemble the fairy tale the world projected onto it. But fairy tales don't survive addiction, fear, contracts, and fame. Adults do. And for the first time in years, both of them felt like adults inside the same room. No longer fighting shadows, no longer measuring love in clauses or applause. Just two people who had stopped mistaking fear for hate. And that quiet realization was more powerful than any gasp-inducing headline ever could be. By the time the storm finally quieted, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like clarity. There was no grand reunion, no dramatic vow renewal, no magazine cover announcing that love had conquered all. Instead, what remained was something far less glamorous and far more difficult. Two people choosing honesty over illusion. Keith had stopped trying to resurrect the version of their marriage that once dazzled the public. He no longer chased the idea of being the perfect redemption story. Sobriety was no longer a performance for her reassurance or for the headlines. It became a private discipline, a daily decision, a quiet promise he made to himself before he made it to anyone else. Nicole, in her own way, softened too. Not recklessly, not naively, but intentionally. She stopped scanning for signs of collapse in every small misstep. She stopped interpreting silence as danger. She didn't remove the boundaries, but she no longer weaponized them defensively in her mind. The contract remained what it was, protection, not punishment. One evening, they sat together on the back porch in Nashville, the air cool and still. The girls were inside finishing homework. The house felt calm, not tense, not fragile, just calm. "I used to think if we didn't fix everything, we failed," Nicole said quietly. Keith nodded. "I used to think if you ever stopped needing to watch me, it meant you stopped loving me." She turned toward him, surprised. "Why would you think that?" "Because I confused attention with devotion," he admitted. "If you weren't worried about me, I thought you'd moved on." She let that sit between them. "And I confused control with care," she said. "If I wasn't setting rules, I thought I wasn't protecting us." There it was, the core of everything. He mistook her fear for rejection. She mistook his autonomy for instability. Two misinterpretations feeding each other for years. The relief of naming it out loud was heavier than any apology. They didn't need to relive every argument. They didn't need to rehash every headline. They had reached a place beyond accusation. What they needed now was sustainability. Keith adjusted his touring schedule permanently. Fewer dates, longer breaks, more time in Nashville. Not because she demanded it, but because he finally understood that stability is not something you negotiate under pressure. It's something you build proactively. Nicole, too, recalibrated her work rhythm. She stopped overloading herself with back-to-back filming schedules that left her emotionally unavailable at home. She began prioritizing presence over momentum. Neither decision was framed as sacrifice. They were framed as alignment. Their daughters noticed the shift long before anyone else. Dinner conversations lasted longer. Laughter felt easier. The house no longer carried the invisible weight of tension. The children stopped asking subtle questions about whether Dad was okay. They simply assumed he was. One night, after tucking the girls into bed, Keith found Nicole in the kitchen pouring tea. "You know," he said gently, "I don't want us to go back." She looked up cautious. "Back? To what we were trying to prove." A slow smile appeared on her face. "Neither do I." That acknowledgement mattered more than reconciliation. They weren't chasing romance. They were choosing partnership. There is a difference. Romance burns brightly. Partnership endures quietly. They began going on simple walks again, not as a couple staging recovery, but as two people comfortable enough to share silence. The conversations were no longer about relapse risk or legal security. They were about their daughters' personalities, about music, about films, about aging. At one point, Nicole stopped mid-walk and said something that lingered. "I don't need you to be perfect anymore." Keith laughed softly. "Good. I retired from that role." She studied him. "I just need you to be honest before things break." He nodded. "And I need you to tell me when fear starts talking instead of love." They weren't promising invincibility. They were promising transparency. And that was new. The truth is, the horrors Keith once alluded to weren't about living with Nicole Kidman. They were about living with himself while being loved by someone strong enough to demand better. The real terror had been facing his reflection every morning and knowing that one bad choice could ripple through 3 other lives. The real discomfort had been understanding that accountability doesn't end once sobriety begins. And for Nicole, the true exhaustion hadn't come from loving a flawed man. It had come from loving him while bracing for impact. Now, the bracing had eased. Not disappeared, but softened. They didn't declare a new beginning. They didn't announce a healed fairy tale. They simply adjusted. And sometimes, that's the most mature form of love there is. Not fireworks. Not headlines. Just two people sitting on a porch in Nashville, aware of the darkness they survived, and choosing quietly to keep the light on. In the end, the story was never about horror in the way headlines wanted it to be. It wasn't about a villain hiding behind closed doors or a glamorous marriage rotting from some scandalous secret. The real weight of it, the part that makes people uncomfortable, was much simpler and much more human. It was about two strong people loving each other while carrying different kinds of fear. Keith once believed the worst thing that could happen was losing Nicole. But over time, he realized something deeper. The worst thing would have been losing himself and dragging his family down in the process. Addiction had taught him that charm is not character. Talent is not stability. Apologies are not change. And being forgiven once does not guarantee being trusted forever. Nicole, for her part, learned something equally painful. Loving someone who struggles does not mean sacrificing your own safety. Standing by someone does not mean standing in front of their collapse repeatedly. Strength is not about endurance alone. It's about knowing when to draw a line before love turns into damage. There were years when they both mistook fear for rejection. When she asked questions, he heard accusation. When he defended himself, she heard denial. When she built legal boundaries, he heard conditional love. When he chased autonomy, she heard instability. Neither interpretation was entirely fair, but neither was entirely irrational either. Fame amplified every crack. Public narratives distorted private nuance. The world saw a fairy tale and then looked for a tragedy. But the truth was far less cinematic and far more intimate. Their marriage became a mirror. It forced them to confront who they were under pressure. And that confrontation hurt. There were nights when silence felt heavier than arguments. There were mornings when eye contact carried the memory of past wounds. There were seasons when coexisting felt safer than connecting. But what ultimately saved them was not romance. It was responsibility. Responsibility to their daughters. Responsibility to their own mental health. Responsibility to the version of themselves they wanted to grow into. By the time they reached a place of calm, it didn't look like the beginning of a new love story. It looked like adulthood. Less dramatic, less dazzling, but more honest. Keith stopped trying to prove he was worthy of love through grand gestures. He proved it through consistency, through being present, through staying sober when no one was watching, through admitting fear before it metastasized into secrecy. Nicole stopped trying to prevent disaster before it happened. She allowed space for imperfection without assuming catastrophe. She protected her family without turning protection into punishment. And that is the quiet conclusion no headline can monetize. Love doesn't survive because it's magical. It survives because two people learn how to stop fighting shadows. The marriage that once felt like a fairy tale did not become a nightmare. It became something real. Less applause, more truth, less performance, more presence. In the end, the greatest confession Keith could make was not about the horrors of being married to Nicole Kidman. It was this: loving a strong woman forced him to become stronger himself. And sometimes that transformation is uncomfortable enough to feel terrifying. But it's not horror, it's growth.